The day I came home and found my neighbor's SUV parked on my driveway was the day I realized some people don't slowly become entitled. They arrive that way. What made it even crazier was that he wasn't apologizing, wasn't asking for permission, wasn't even pretending it was a mistake. He was standing there with a coffee mug in his hand looking at me like I was the one who had wandered onto his property. Looking back now, that moment feels almost funny, because neither of us knew that a simple driveway dispute was about to turn into a year-long war involving lawyers, police officers, surveyors, construction crews, and one very memorable portable toilet. My name is Daniel Harper, and 8 years ago I bought a small corner lot house in a blue-collar neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio. It wasn't fancy, but I loved it. The house had 2 bedrooms, a detached garage, and the feature that mattered most to me, a wide gravel driveway that wrapped around the side yard. I owned a landscaping company, and every morning before sunrise I'd load equipment, hook up trailers, and head out to job sites. That driveway wasn't just part of my property. It was part of my livelihood. The neighborhood had always been simple and quiet. Most of the families had lived there for years. We waved at each other, borrowed ladders, watched each other's houses during vacations. Nobody was getting rich, but people respected each other. Then the Callaways moved in next door. Ethan and Melissa Callaway bought the old Jenkins house after Mr. Jenkins passed away. From the first week, it was obvious they viewed the neighborhood differently than everyone else. They weren't bad-looking people. In fact, they were the kind of polished suburban couple you'd see in real estate advertisements. Matching luxury SUVs, designer clothes, constant renovations. Every weekend, another contractor showed up. New stone patio, new windows, imported landscaping, outdoor lighting that made their backyard look like a resort. At first, nobody minded. It was their house. They could do whatever they wanted with it. The problem started when they began acting like they could do whatever they wanted with everyone else's property too. Ethan complained about kids riding bicycles too close to his lawn. He complained about dogs barking. He complained about basketball hoops. And eventually he started complaining about my work truck. One afternoon, I was washing mud off the trailer when he walked over carrying a beer. "You ever think about parking that somewhere else?" he asked casually. I laughed because I honestly thought he was joking. "Somewhere else?" I said. "It's in my driveway." He took a sip of his beer and shrugged. "Just saying it kind of hurts the appearance of the street." That was the first moment I realized we weren't going to be friends. A couple months later, I came outside one morning and found 3 bright orange traffic cones sitting on the edge of my driveway near the property line. I figured some kids had moved them from a nearby construction project, so I picked them up and set them on Ethan's lawn. That evening, he knocked on my door. He had one of those smiles that never reaches the eyes. "Hey Daniel," he said. "About those cones." "What about them?" I asked. "Melissa and I were talking. We think that section of driveway would work better as shared space." I actually laughed. "Shared space?" "Yeah. You don't use all of it all the time. We have guests over frequently. It would help everybody." I stared at him for a few seconds because I honestly couldn't tell if he was serious. "Ethan, that's my driveway." The smile disappeared almost instantly. Property boundaries aren't always as clear as people think. I remember feeling a strange chill when he said that. It wasn't the words. It was the confidence. Like he'd already decided how the story was going to end. "Actually, they are pretty clear," I replied. "That's why they're called property lines." He stared at me for another moment, then nodded slowly. "We'll see." Those 2 words stayed in my head for days. A week later, I found out exactly what he meant. I had spent the entire day installing retaining walls across town. It was nearly 7 o'clock when I pulled onto my street. At first, I thought I was looking at the wrong house. Fresh black asphalt stretched across part of my driveway. A decorative vinyl fence stood where open space had always been. For several seconds, I just sat in my truck trying to understand what I was seeing. Then I got out and walked closer. My stomach dropped. The fence wasn't on the property line. It wasn't even close. It extended nearly 8 feet into my side yard and blocked access to a section of my driveway. Fresh tire marks showed someone had already been driving across it. I walked straight to the Callaway's front door and knocked hard enough to rattle the glass. Melissa answered, holding a wine glass. She looked completely relaxed. "Can I help you?" she asked. "Your husband paved part of my driveway and built a fence on my property." She didn't even blink. Instead, she took a slow sip of wine. "Ethan had a survey done." "No, he didn't." "Well, apparently he did because that section belongs to us." The way she said it made my blood boil. Not because she sounded convincing, because she sounded rehearsed. Like they had already discussed exactly how this conversation would go. I drove back home, dug through every document I owned, and spread them across my kitchen table. My deed, my purchase survey, county records, plat maps. By midnight, I had confirmed exactly what I already knew. Every inch of that stolen section belonged to me. And that's when I picked up my phone and called Ethan. He answered on the second ring. Before I could finish explaining, he started laughing. "If you've got a problem," he said, "call a lawyer." Then he hung up. Sitting there alone in my kitchen, staring at years of legal paperwork spread across the table. I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a challenge. And unfortunately for Ethan Calloway, he had just challenged the one thing I cared about almost as much as my business, my home. The next morning, I called an attorney before I even poured my first cup of coffee, and within 15 minutes, I learned something that would become both frustrating and useful. Frustrating because property disputes move at the speed of cold molasses. Useful because my lawyer made one thing very clear. "Daniel, until a court says otherwise, that land is still legally yours." At the time, I didn't fully appreciate what that meant. A few weeks later, I understood perfectly. While the paperwork crawled through the system, Ethan treated my property like he had already won. Every evening, his SUV sat on the section he'd stolen. When friends came over, they parked there too. He installed decorative landscape lights along the edge of the asphalt he had poured over my driveway. One Saturday, I was hooking up my trailer when he walked over and actually complained that my equipment blocked the view from his patio. I remember looking at him and wondering whether he genuinely believed his own nonsense, or if he had simply repeated it so many times that it became reality in his head. "You're blocking the sight line," he said. "It's not exactly attractive." I laughed. "You're standing on my property while saying that." He rolled his eyes and walked away. The thing about people like Ethan is that they mistake patience for weakness. I wasn't patient because I was afraid of him. I was patient because I understood that the law takes time. But eventually I reached a point where I stopped asking myself how to get even and started asking myself a much better question. How do I remind him exactly who owns that land? The answer arrived on a Tuesday morning. One of my suppliers was delivering mulch for a commercial project. 10 yards of it. Normally I would have it unloaded behind my garage. Instead, while standing with my coffee watching the truck back up, I pointed toward the disputed section. "Right there," I said. The driver looked at me. "You sure?" "Absolutely." A few seconds later, an enormous mountain of mulch landed directly across the area Ethan had turned into his personal parking spot. It was magnificent. By pure coincidence, Ethan chose that exact moment to walk outside. He was wearing a bathrobe and carrying a travel mug. The look on his face was worth every penny. "What the hell is this?" he shouted. I took another sip of coffee. "Mulch. Move it." "Why?" "You're blocking our driveway." I couldn't help smiling. "No, Ethan. I'm using my property." For a moment I thought he might actually explode. He stood there pointing at the pile while searching desperately for an argument that didn't make him sound ridiculous. He never found one. The mulch stayed there for 3 days. Every morning I walked outside and admired it like a piece of public art. Melissa responded by leaving passive-aggressive notes in my mailbox. One note said responsible homeowners care about neighborhood appearance. Another suggested I was lowering property values. I kept every note, not because they mattered legally, but because they were hilarious. A week later I escalated. If mulch was a reminder, gravel was a statement. Another delivery truck arrived carrying 10 tons of crushed stone. Once again, I directed the load directly onto the disputed section. The resulting pile looked like a small mountain range. This time, Ethan didn't even bother coming to talk. Instead, he called the police. 2 officers arrived around lunchtime. By then, several neighbors had wandered outside pretending to do yard work while secretly watching the show. One officer asked for my side of the story. I handed him copies of my survey and property records. He studied them carefully, then looked across the yard at Ethan's fence. The second officer measured a few reference points. Meanwhile, Ethan stood nearby, getting angrier by the minute. Finally, he walked over. "He's blocking our driveway," he said. The officer looked at him. "Sir, according to these documents, that's his property. But we use it. That doesn't change ownership." Ethan pointed dramatically at the gravel pile. "This is ridiculous." The officer shrugged. "Then maybe you shouldn't have built your driveway on someone else's land." I swear one of my neighbors nearly choked trying not to laugh. After the police left, word spread through the neighborhood faster than wildfire. People who had barely spoken to me in years suddenly found reasons to stop by. Everyone wanted updates. Everyone wanted to know what Ethan was going to do next. The truth was I didn't know. But I had one more idea. A couple weeks later, my crews were working a large commercial project across town. We rented a portable toilet for convenience. When the project ended, the rental company offered to leave it for a few extra weeks at no additional charge before pickup. Most people would have declined. I did not. The bright blue portable toilet arrived on a Friday afternoon. I positioned it perfectly along the disputed property line, where it could be seen from Ethan's patio, kitchen window, and living room. It wasn't blocking access. It wasn't violating any ordinances. It was simply existing. Legally. Magnificently. Every time I walked outside and saw it sitting there, I smiled. Melissa absolutely hated it. One afternoon, she marched across the yard. "You're doing this on purpose." "Doing what?" I asked. "That thing. It's a portable toilet." "I know what it is." "Then we're making progress." She stormed off before I could continue. The funniest part was that neighbors started treating it like a local landmark. One guy joked that it deserved its own address. Another suggested putting Christmas lights around it. Even my attorney laughed when I sent him a photo. But beneath the humor, the legal case continued moving forward. Surveyors visited. Documents were exchanged. Depositions were scheduled. And that's when Ethan made what would eventually become the biggest mistake of his life. Instead of backing down, he sued me. According to his complaint, my deliveries had caused financial damage, emotional distress, and interference with the enjoyment of his property. When my lawyer called to tell me, I nearly dropped the phone laughing. "He's actually suing?" I asked. "He is? For using my own land?" "Apparently." My attorney paused. "The good news is that this gives us an opportunity to counterclaim." And that's exactly what we did. Property encroachment, unauthorized construction, trespass, damage to private property, legal costs, survey expenses, everything. Once the paperwork was filed, the tone changed immediately. Up until then, Ethan had acted like a man certain he would win. Now he looked nervous. For the first time, I noticed him avoiding eye contact. The confidence was fading. The reality of a courtroom was getting closer. Months later, when the hearing finally arrived, I sat quietly beside my attorney while Ethan occupied the opposite side of the room. He looked tired, older somehow. The judge reviewed the filings and began hearing testimony. My surveyor took the stand first. He was professional, precise, and impossible to shake. Using maps, measurements, county records, and official markers, he demonstrated exactly where the property line sat. The evidence was overwhelming. Then Ethan presented the survey he claimed justified everything. The courtroom became very quiet, because it wasn't actually a survey at all. It was a rough sketch based on measurements he had personally taken using a tape measure. For several seconds, even the judge looked confused. Then came the question that changed everything. "Mr. Calloway," the judge asked, "are you telling this court that you replaced a licensed survey with your own estimate?" Ethan opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. And in that moment, I realized the entire case had just collapsed right in front of everyone. What happened next was one of those moments that feels slow while you're living it, and fast when you remember it years later. Ethan sat there staring at the judge, trying to find a way out of a hole he had dug with his own shovel. But every answer only made things worse. The judge asked him again why he had ignored official property records, why he had built a fence across land he didn't own, and why he believed a few measurements taken with a tape measure somehow outweighed legally recorded surveys. Ethan stumbled through several explanations, none of which made much sense. At one point, he actually suggested that the property lines were open to interpretation. I remember seeing the judge lean back slightly in his chair and remove his glasses. That's never a good sign. A few minutes later, the ruling came down. Every inch of the disputed section belonged to me. The fence had to be removed. The asphalt connection had to be demolished. The property had to be restored to its original condition. Ethan and Melissa were responsible for all restoration costs. On top of that, they were ordered to reimburse my legal fees and survey expenses. Just like that, nearly a year of arrogance turned into one very expensive lesson. I wish I could tell you Ethan stood up, apologized, and learned something meaningful from the experience, but real life rarely works that way. He left the courtroom without looking at me. Melissa followed close behind. Neither of them said a word. About 3 weeks later, I came home from work and found a demolition crew tearing apart the asphalt connection they had been so proud of. The decorative fence was already gone. Chunks of broken pavement sat piled beside the road, waiting to be hauled away. I parked across the street for a few minutes and simply watched. Not because I enjoyed seeing people lose money. At least that's what I told myself. The truth is, there was something deeply satisfying about watching reality finally catch up to someone who had spent months pretending rules didn't apply to him. One of the workers noticed me and waved. "You the owner?" he asked. "Yeah." He laughed. This whole thing could have been avoided if they'd just stayed on their side. You're not the first person to say that. Within a month, my driveway looked almost exactly the way it had before the entire mess began. Fresh gravel replaced damaged sections. The yard was restored. New grass started growing where equipment had torn up the soil. For the first time in nearly a year, everything felt normal again. The portable toilet disappeared. The gravel pile was gone. The mulch had long since been used on projects. Peace returned to the neighborhood. Or at least something close to peace. The funny thing is that after all the drama, most of my neighbors didn't talk about the lawsuit itself. They talked about the choices that led to it. People kept asking the same question. Why didn't Ethan just ask? If he had come over honestly and said he needed temporary parking while hosting family or working on renovations, I probably would have helped. Most people in the neighborhood would have helped. That's what neighbors do. But somewhere along the line, he convinced himself that wanting something and owning something were the same thing. They aren't. And that's a lesson that tends to get expensive. About 6 months later, the Callaways put their house on the market. I don't know whether the lawsuit was the reason. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. I never asked. The day the moving truck arrived, Ethan and I crossed paths one last time near the sidewalk. For a second, I thought he might finally say something about everything that happened. Instead, he looked at me and said, "You really enjoyed making this difficult, didn't you?" I laughed before I could stop myself. "No, Ethan. You made it difficult. I just refused to make it easy." He stared at me for a moment, then shook his head and walked away. That was the last conversation we ever had. Sometimes people ask whether I regret the whole battle. Honestly, not really. It cost time, energy, and more stress than I wanted, but it also taught me something important. If you let people take a little today, they'll come back for a little more tomorrow. Boundaries matter. Property lines matter. Respect matters. And when those things disappear, communities fall apart. These days, when I back my truck into that driveway before sunrise, everything looks ordinary again. Most people driving past would never know a legal war happened there. They'd never know that a pile of mulch, 10 tons of gravel, and a bright blue portable toilet became symbols in a fight over something as simple as a few feet of land. But I know, and every time I see that stretch of driveway, I remember one simple truth. Some lessons can be explained politely. Others require a judge, a demolition crew, and a very large invoice. Now here's what I want to know from you. If a neighbor had taken part of your property and refused to back down, would you have handled it the same way? Or did I take things too far with the mulch, gravel, and portable toilet? Let me know down in the comments, because I guarantee people are going to be divided on this one. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who appreciates a little property line justice. Until next time, stay safe, look out for your neighbors, and always know exactly where your property line is.